Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we're not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. So, welcome to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. I'm David Miller, the Secretary of the Society. Now, our speaker today is Dr. Vaughan Rapatahana, and his topic is Colin Wilson and his new existentialism. Vaughan.
Kia ora, tātou katoa, no Aotearoa. So I'm just saying hello to everybody from New Zealand. It's not the first time I've been a speaker at the Australian Existentialist Society. I've been over to Melbourne a couple of times in the last decade and given a talk. So it's interesting to be on Zoom and to be able to do so. I thought before I start on anything that I was going to start, I think I want to pay a tribute to a leading Australian philosopher and writer and a damn good fellow who attended Existentialist Society frequently. That's Howard Dosser, who passed away earlier this year. So I'd like to just to mention him and pay a bit of a tribute to him and a bit of respect to Howard. Howard, of course, was a biographer of Colin Wilson, a good friend of Colin Wilson, but he also wrote on other topics like the work of Kazantzakis. So I don't know if you can remember Howard, David, and people attending today. He did come to the Existentialist Society meetings sometimes.
Yes, he delivered possibly a dozen or more lectures over the years.
Yes. So tribute to Howard. Okay, now that goes back to this Colin Wilson. I'll give a little bit of detail about myself. I'm not really going to talk much about Colin Wilson today because I've done that ad nauseum over the years. I did my PhD in the works of Colin Wilson, existential literary criticism, which is what Colin Wilson's own theory, which basically meant that you didn't judge you judged literature only by the existential value it had. So when Colin Wilson looked at a text, philosophical or fictive, he basically is trying to work out what meaning giving is this writer giving us as a reader, not worried about so much the style or the content so much, but the ideas coming across. So using his tenet of existential literary criticism, I criticized Wilson's own novels. And of course, he didn't always match up to his own tenets in his own novels. So I did my doctorate at the University of Auckland last century on Wilson, and I met Colin for the first time in Melbourne. And who streamlined that meeting? Howard Dosser out at Footscray, where he was the dean, I think. So that was in 1994. And since then, I've written quite a lot of books about Wilson. This one, I don't know if you can see it, was published. It sort of sums up all my thoughts and philosophies about Wilson. And most of it's been published before in journals like Philosophy Now, etc., etc. But I did write one original piece in here, More Than the Existentialist Outsider, where I basically said Colin Wilson actually was so far outside, he was inside. In the sense that he was actually also a language philosopher and had a lot of similarities to Austin, of all people. So I'll talk about that a bit later on. And I'll begin this particular talk today. So I'll incorporate some things about Wilson, but I'm going to start off with the doctrine of ultimate pointlessness, which was my own philosophy. It was triggered by a quote, which is probably very well known by now, by Steven Weinberg, the physicist, which is, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. I don't know if you can read that top one there. Can you read that, David? We've lost your voice.
Oh, Move it up to the level of your eyes and we'll be able to see it.
You can see it now? This top one.
Yes.
And I will extrapolate again on what Stephen said. As a Nobel Prize winning physicist, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. In other words, the more meaning he could find, the more structures, the more things connected together, the more pointless it came across. So I want to differentiate here between meaning and purpose and point. Like, to me, they're completely different things. So meaning is logos, which is the intentional reason for doing something. Purpose is telos, the fulfillment of that meaning. So you might have meaning and purpose, but so what? What is the point of that meaning and purpose? Right, so I'll talk for a little bit, and then we'll talk further on, a bit of dialogue, some questions, etc., etc. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the doctrine of ultimate pointlessness, the doctrine that says that if there is any meaning whatsoever to our human existence, indeed to existence per se, the meaning ascribed can always be countered with the phrase, so what? Okay, so I've conflated logos, meaning, with telos, purpose, and I'm countering it with point. What is the point of anything or everything? Existence per se is ultimately pointless. Being as such as pointless is ultimately absurd. Even if we answer the question, why this particular design, the eternal response will be, so what? Or like the 4-year-old's decisive refrains, why, or prove it to any answer, what is the point of any meaning? There's a series of perhaps endless regressions here, Chinese boxes, if you will. When we peel back the layers of the meaning onion, we can always say, so what? So the paradigm expands exponentially, rather like Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Okay, so that's my basic over parameters. Okay, you might have a meaning, we might have a purpose here today, but so what? And just keep on asking, so what, why, possibly ad infinitum. So let me be a little more specific. Number one, if for every event, every creation, everything, there is no ultimate purpose, the doctrine is self-explanatory. So postmodernists everywhere, as well as some French existentialists, of course, just roll over, sort of I told you so smiles encrusted on their faces. For them, any meaning we claim for ourselves is a man-made construct of fiction. Everything is already written, including ourselves. That's what Barthes said, of course. Okay, we're already written. So for postmodernists, some French existentialists, there's no meaning, there's no possible meaning. However, number two, if however, the very definition of meaning implies that there has to be a meaning for this meaning and so on, otherwise the word meaning is meaningless. Then three, if there is a prescribed meaning for any event, creation, anything, what is the ultimate point of this meaning? There can never be an ultimate point, but only an infinity of ultimate pointlessness. Infinity poses no problems for the doctrine, for one can always say or state, so what to it? Welcome to a verbal version of Sisyphus and eternal recurrence. Four, but if there is somehow a finite meaning, this would seem to be pointless too, for one can still ask, so what? That is, if there is cogency to any given final meaning, we continue with our refrain of ultimate pointlessness, whether any such meaning is ours to impose, thus a humanistic approach, or is imposed on us perhaps by via some theocratic super being. So these are all possible variations on the doctrine of ultimate pointlessness. The hackles are already arisen on your respective necks. You are ready to spit at me vituperatively and say, what of God, you say, you fool? What of the Creator who knows all beyond our possible ken? Well, I guess my response to that will be, trust in the Creator, people will say. My answer is thus, given that there is indeed somehow some form of Creator incorporating or aside from strict religious tenets, so what? The Creator may indeed have some agenda beyond human comprehension, but this in itself presupposes some sort of meaning. What is the point of that meaning? The Creator may have a perfectly rational, even completely irrational explanation for human existence, but even so, what is the use of this existence? More, what is the purpose, if you will, of this Creator's existence? Again, eternal recurrence of asking the meaning, the why, even if it's beyond our ken at this stage. Or if you're not into theocratic beings, a benign being putting us all down here for some reason only known to them. Or what if there are UFOs out there who originally engineered humanity and visit us now and again? Why them? They also may have their own scheme, but whatever it is, so what? What does it matter that they may have visited us thousands of years ago and still intermittently do so with some secret agenda? So what? Any agenda has a purpose, but what is the final purpose? It can never be one. Again, the infinite regression. Or granted, as just one further instance that speculative realists are correct and that mankind is no centrifugal repository of an ultimate meaning, the objective and antediluvian existence of objects, whether as cold, barren, impersonal realities or as swathed in a sort of material vitalism, is also ultimately pointless. So I don't know if people have been reading speculative realism like Melisau and Ray Brassier. For them, if anything, an ultimate and somewhat flat meaninglessness is reified there. So the speculative realist would basically say all that exists is a vast, purposeless place in which we can see no evidence of a point for ourselves as human beings. Okay? Now, of course, Colin Wilson would vehemently oppose just about all of these particular. We'll get back to this, Alex. You have plenty of time to answer. Okay. But there's no need for depression. Facing the reality of ultimate pointlessness does not mean giving up the ghost, so to speak. We are here, why not relax and enjoy it? We may go to heaven, we may stay there for infinity. So what? We may come back as reptiles or as newborn human babies in some form of reincarnation process. We may even be transported to planet Xaxis. We may develop some previously unknown mind stage that irradiates us to meanings previously beyond ken. Now that's where Colin Wilson came in with his new existentialism. Very logocentric, though he's contradiction, I'll get onto that later, where he felt that mankind should sink into his inner consciousness and develop the mind so as to work out things better. And he's saying that this, so far, which is why he's a language philosopher, we haven't got the language to describe these inner states that sometimes are enlightening. So Colin Wilson's whole new existentialism was based on an optimistic overview that mankind has much more in here and should develop inner consciousness. Okay, but then I would say, why? Just as there may well be some rationale behind the composition of this very doctrine, we can never eschew ultimately responding to it via a shrug of the shoulders and a resounding so what? For nothing behoves us to believe that there is any final point except that of the ultimate pointlessness. It can never be anything else. So, point against meaning and purpose, they are different things, because we can all sum up a meaning or purpose and rationalize it and set it out. But what is the point of that? Why? And then you might give a reason for that. Then you can say, why again? And you might say there's a God. You might say there's foreign beings. You might say, like Wilson, at his most objective, analytical side, develop the inner human consciousness. And I would say, so what? So what? It's okay. Similarly, just as we can never seem to know our own minds completely, given that we utilize our minds to understand our minds, would seem also that we can never know an ultimate meaning anyway. And if we do in some magical, unknown way formulate what seems an ultimate meaning, then what is the point of that? Rational thought might perhaps penetrate to some final ultimate truth, given massive advances in neurophysiological understanding and via an exponential augmentation in physics per se, but it might just as well never do so. What did Richard Feynman once use? Okay, this is another one. Another great physicist sort of backing up Weinberg, and I'll hold this up at eye level as well. This is Richard Feynman. Can you read that okay? Can you see that one?
Hold it up higher.
The great accumulation of understanding as to how the physical world behaves only convinces one that this behavior is a kind of meaninglessness about it. So both Feynman and Weinberg basically come from the same area. the more they discover about the physical world and the world of physics, the less meaning there seems to be, the less point there seems to be. Doesn't mean to say they give up in despair, because they've got their own answers, which I'll get on to. So, so what, anyway, to any rationale, any pattern or non-pattern? There may well somehow indeed be a meaning of life, but what is the purpose of this meaning? What is the point of it all? Okay. Now, this is where Weinberg comes from. Yet the very absurdity of our position, in a sense, emancipates us, frees us. In pointlessness lies our existential freedom. We are obliged to be free. Such emancipation creates momentum, and this in its own sweet way creates purpose. Thus, in the refulgent epiphany of our totally pointless existence, we perceive, generate our own purpose, and are free, untraveled to ever attain it. As Ortega y Gasset said, each man is the author of himself. Okay? We can give ourselves a sense of purpose just by the way we live, which is what Weinberg says. We can be better human beings. Okay, we accept it's pointless. There's no ultimate point. Because there is a being as opposed to non-being, let us seize our being, let us manufacture ourselves ad infinitum. Why not? And again, that's where Camus and to Sartre, to a degree, came in and said, be authentic to your own purpose. However, if it's ultimately pointless. Okay. I'll get on to another bit about Woolston. Now, any questions so far? Because I've gone through it pretty rapidly, and I've come from physicists untremoling of what they can see as more and more things fitting together and less point to it.
Could I suggest that if you have a comment or question, you use the raised hand facility that you'll find in the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. So Akiva has his hand raised. Go ahead.
So Vaughan, commenting on a question. So physics, you probably would accept, is not the place to find the answers to ultimate purpose, meaning, or point. And then the question is really how exactly you differentiate between something being pointless, not being pointless, even if it's meaningful to the individual. How are those actually distinct concepts?
No, I fully agree that they can be meaningful to an individual or to a community. And I'm saying, it's taking a step back from that individual and that community. What is the point of their meaning? To them, it's not pointless. To them, it's very meaningful and valuable. And good luck to them, fine. But
so you have, if I may be allowed this observation, in your comments, you can play back the recording, used pointless in as a synonym of meaningful or meaningless. I believe you just did that. So I think there isn't a real semantic difference between something being pointless and meaningless. I think the distinction is perspective. And if you're looking for a universal perspective, then the universe is cold and empty and has no meaning. Meaning, by definition, from an existential point of view, arises from the meaning maker. And therefore, I'm not sure you're saying anything substantive in terms of life being meaningless from a global or universal perspective, true, but meaningful from a individual perspective.
100%. I just said that. I just said, yes, the very absurdity of our position frees us. In pointlessness lies our existential freedom. So you can make your own meanings by the way you live and what you believe. I fully agree with you, because that's exactly what I said. And that's where certain existentialists say, yes, become authentic to something, even if you have their own awareness that it's pointless. Live better, live well. Okay, live in league with your fellow humans.
So if I've understood you, one more go from me. I think I'd find your last comment very helpful, Vaughan. The pointless notion that you've got is a cosmic perspective, that even though I and my community may in fact find our lives meaningful and purposeful, you're still saying the so what question exists because it's pointless from a global or universal perspective. 100%. So you're using pointless as to whether there's any ultimate point. May I suggest that one glosses pointless in the way it being defined by Dr. R as being globally meaningless. There is no
Yes.
global meaning. That's effectively you're
That's
offering a
what
synonym.
I'm saying. I'm
Okay,
saying that
thank you.
100%. Maybe I wasn't clear enough at the beginning, but that last part I read is up to the individual or the group of individuals or community or even a nation, should they have the same views in common, to have their own meaning. And if they're religious people and they want their own community and religion, no problem. But I'm saying globally meaningless. No, I'm not trying to say you shouldn't have your own meaning. I'm trying to say that you should, because things are so pointless, go ahead and find your own meaning.
But things
Okay.
are only pointless in a global perspective. Again,
Yes.
the word pointless in everyday usage is going to be pretty close to meaningless. So it is only globally pointless in the same way that it's globally meaningless. But it individually has a point. You have a point. You've chosen to address an audience in Melbourne today. You have some point in doing that. It's meaningful for you. I'm suggesting that those are synonyms, and you need to use the global or universal as a modifier of pointless.
Well, I thought I'd done that. That's why it's called the doctrine of ultimate pointlessness. I said that at the beginning. Okay.
Fair enough. Thank you. I'm now up to speed.
Existentially pointless. This is the existentialist society. Existentially pointless. It can be meaningful for the individual or the individual and his cronies, to me, which is Maori, etc. Now, there's another alternative. So I said you can have God, you can believe in UFOs, you can be Eric von Daniken or his followers. They can all be meanings for you in that group, but existentially, ultimately pointless. Okay, which is I'm trying to, and I'll reiterate what Feynman and Weinberg say, because they're discovering more and more existentially and globally pointless. And the speculative realists, who are very well worth getting into, they're a French-oriented school of philosophers who are not really favored, is that the right word? They're not really well liked by academic philosophers because they have a whole different approach whatsoever. They're basically saying mankind is a nothing in an impersonal, barren universe. As I said, Ray Brazier written a very interesting book about nihilism. So, but we won't go down there. So that leads on to my last point. Even though it's ultimately pointless, even though that you and I are talking here is pointless in the end, today I'm talking to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and you fellas are listening, and we're discussing meaning for what we're doing. What we're doing today is trying to find a point. And I'm saying ultimately, perhaps there's none. Now, and there is one other thing that must be said at this juncture. This is where we bring in Colin Wilson. So Colin Wilson's got two poles. One, he's trying to revitalize existentialism away from the fairly pessimistic, very stoic existentialism of Sartre, especially. Camus was even less positive than Sartre. And Colin Wilson has his new existentialism where he says, if we can develop the inner being, the inner consciousness, the meaning of life will become more clear. That's Wilson's whole philosophy. By developing a whole lot of incremental steps, developing the language. So he agreed with Wittgenstein, he agreed with Austin about developing language to name inner states that sometimes we come across, even if sometimes it's through drink and drugs. But there's another aspect of Wilson, which is a contradiction. And this one sort of turns the doctrine of ultimate pointlessness slightly askew. So there is one other thing that must be said at this juncture, my friends, and it is this. Sometimes, and this will probably apply to all of us, indeed, we are transported to, or we transport ourselves into states of munificent bliss where we don't even give a brass razoo about questions of meaning and purpose. Okay, we become self-drunk on our own endorphin, dopamine, testosterone. The doctrine of ultimate pointlessness then is in abeyance, even though there is no escaping its ramifications. So in our mystic panoptic state, beyond selfish individuality, in our merging with some anonymous, ubiquitous meta-being, the doctrine of ultimate pointlessness, despite its ironclad veracity, will be the last thing on our or we won't call them minds. Because there is being, we are duty bound to be parts of it. Because there is, why not delight in it? So what I'm saying is sometimes we have immense feelings of delight. It could come through drink, drugs, sexual episodes. And the last thing in our minds, if we've even got minds, is philosophy and existential philosophy. The last thing in our minds is things like the doctrine of ultimate pointlessness. This is not rational mind transportation at all. And now, this is mysticism. This is a mystical transportation. I don't know if any of you fellows have had these sort of episodes, but Wilson did. Wilson fundamentally was an English mystic, as well as being a fairly objective, analytic English existentialist philosopher. So he had these two poles that didn't quite match up, because on the one hand, he wanted to have a logocentric individual developing within on small incremental steps. And on the other hand, he had these individual, including himself, mind blasted out of all those steps and being really aware of something amazing. So there's a complete contradiction in terms, which I've written about with Wilson. So I'll go back to what postmodernists like Derrida and his cronies were trying to do, postmodernist writers. They seek a thorough deconstruction of the self, a fundamental breakdown of the subject-object dichotomy, so complete as to destroy it completely. Okay? That's what postmodernist writers do. And so even if Wilson clings so avidly in fact and fiction and personality to an heroic, omnipresent, logocentric ego, basically Colin Wilson himself, all his novels are basically him developing superpowers from within with discipline and positive thinking. But he often betrays himself within the same book when his visionary mystic soul takes over and sweeps the concentric self far away. So there's almost a complete contradiction even in the same book. So he's got the hero, who is basically Colin Wilson, strong, disciplined, thinking, overcoming all sorts of mental problems, getting stronger mentally, learning more and more about the mind. And then other times he just has an automatic, wonderful, mystic vision where things like this don't matter. The doctrine of ultimate pointlessness is the last thing on anybody's minds. So he's transported away into mysticism. More questions? So that's Wilson and his new existentialism, which has got a sort of a flaw in it, in a sense. One sense, he's trying to build up the individual mind. In another sense, he's got heroes who just totally abnegate that whole sensation. And they sink into mystic bliss, where the self doesn't matter. There's no logocentric transcendental self in a mystic state.
Well, Les and Stephen have both got their hands up. So Les,
Go for it.
Go ahead and make your comment.
Oh, thanks. It's kind of a question for Vaughan, just following on from Akiva's exploring of Vaughan, the way you use the words point and pointless. And I'm trying to get clear myself, because I understand completely your view is that from the point of view of the universe, there is no point. I understand that, but you seem to be saying, and please correct me if I'm mistaken here, you seem to be saying from the perspective of the individual human being, there is no point to anything he does. And let me give you just a brief example to flesh this out. You know, my partner says to me, Les, what's the point of logging in? You logging into Zoom this afternoon? And I say, well, the point is I'm hoping to learn something from Vaughan and others. So from a local perspective, that makes perfect sense.
Yes.
And everyone recognized that makes perfect sense. But from what you were saying, I was getting the picture that ought not make sense, that we ought not be talking about
No.
individual actions having a purpose, or even whole lives having a purpose.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you go ahead and do that. It's fine. It's good that you're developing something positive in league with other wonderful human beings like us people here, all of us handsome and beautiful as well, by the way. That's not a problem. But in the long run, in the global overview, the existential, and we're existentialists here, absolutely pointless. Okay? You're on Earth, grab these opportunities, but so what? Okay? Sorry.
I'm glad you mentioned the so what, because the so what question, you were pushing the point that you can push the so what connection question ad infinitum. You'll never get to the end of the so what questions. But I suppose I'm thinking, well, so what? I mean, if I say to my partner, my point logging into Zoom was I want to learn something, and she'll say, oh, so what? And I'll say, well, I want to learn something to be a better human being, or, to lead a more fulfilling life. And she might say, well, so what? And at that point I say, well, that's the end of the so what's. There's nothing beyond me wanting to lead a more fulfilling life, and learning from Vaughan in this Zoom session is part of that. There's no more so what's after that. That's the termination point.
For you, yes, of course. But, and again, in that ultimate existential sense, so what? Okay. I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing it. Of course, I'm not saying that. In fact, I'm saying you should be doing it. More people should be philosophically inclined and thinking and questioning. Okay, but what's the point? And going back to is that okay?
Thanks.
So there was a question here. What's the difference between Wilson's new existentialism and French existentialism? The point is, and I'm using the word point for Wilson, even though it's ultimately pointless, that the French existentialists were at best stoic. They were quite negative. They just said, there's no meaning to life. It's absurd. There's your wife there behind you. She just said, so what? Said enough of that. Camus especially, they said it's absurd. But Wilson says, no, it's not. If we grab hold of man and his inner states and build up a phenomenological existential vocabulary, we can develop the inner mind. Okay? He was positive. He said existentialism was a way to develop mankind. The French existentialists, none of them were like that whatsoever. They were stoic at best. Okay? There's a major difference. So the new existentialism is a counter to the French existentialists. Okay? And to people like Hemingway, who Wilson wrote about, and other non-academic or non-philosophical per se writers. So he contradicted lots of novelists who he saw, like Samuel Beckett, he hated, okay, because he saw Samuel Beckett as just an example of nihilism and negativeness. And he hated Derrida, of course, postmodernist, because Derrida said it's all in the language. It means nothing. We've got R. Walkers now.
Yes, please keep your microphone muted unless you're actually asking a question. Stephen has his hand up.
I was just going to ask, in relationship to the manifestation of existence, we're talking from a human perspective.
Yes.
Would a rat ask questions like, what's the point of it all? So I think Nietzsche was pointing at that argument out a bit too, that human beings have a sort of a clean, broad slate where they can be anything. A rat's going to be a rat and not deviate from that. The cat's going to be a cat. So the beauty of being the rat is having that fantastic certainty. You've got your mouse hole, you can run out, you can grab some breadcrumbs, get past the cat, have a real thrill that you've gotten past the cat and you've made it home. I'm making the point of The Incredible Shrinking Man, if you've ever heard of that film.
Yeah, I don't know what Bill Jensen just came across the screen, but yeah, I heard that. Yes.
Well, that's the aim, that, you've got this guy who's suffering a sense of depression and he starts shrinking down.
Yes.
And he's battling the spiders and battling the cat, and suddenly he feels like he's Superman, and he's not questioning life anymore. He feels satisfied.
Yes.
He's overcoming. By shrinking, by suffering the disaster, he's actually become happier, oddly enough.
That's okay.
Full of life.
That's okay. look, nothing of what I'm trying to get across here is negative. I'm saying this is actually a go to be more positive and to think more and to develop more.
I have heard a Buddhist use that technique of saying, well, and then what? When the Buddhists are saying, well, what's the point of life?
Yes, yes, that is a Buddhist tenet, but they don't give up and die. You know, they do the best they can. They develop themselves. So going back to Wilson, that tenet where you develop inner consciousness, I still have this issue with his work where I'd say, well, so what, Colin? You might develop and develop. You might get some more understanding what life's all about. But in the end, I'd probably side with people like Stephen Weinberg and say, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But Stephen's a very positive guy. This is where I'm coming from. So all the more reason to develop yourself, create peace, create harmony, get on with your fellow men, do good things. Okay? You've got that ability to do that.
But as a man, I am not good because, like all creatures, I have ambitions which aren't universally good.
So?
Therefore, go on and develop the good, whereas, you know, I want to exercise my animal passions and propagate myself to the end of the universe.
So what?
So what? Yeah, or you're talking about good. Is there such
Well,
a
I'm
thing
just
as
saying,
good and evil in a universal sense in your philosophy?
In the end, they're both pointless.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
So there's no point in being good.
Then in the end, you're going to die, mate. You know. So what? Okay. Even if there's a God out there and he welcomes you to the gates of heaven, so what's the God doing? So what? Even if we can't even get our minds around such a concept, why is there any being? And that's what Weinberg and Feynman are saying. There's being, and the more they develop reasons why there's being, which are, as physicists, they're putting all the nuts and bolts together, there seems less and less point to it. It's just a vast, meaningless quarry. But then there's that, as I said at the very end, the other pole of Wilson's interesting to me, the mystical part, where you develop that, you have these episodes, all the stuff we're talking about today is meaningless because it's the last thing on our minds, which is probably where alcoholism comes in as well. You go down the pub and have
Wilson respected the metaphysical, which is interesting. There's a lot of people who are opposed to the metaphysical, who want to excise it from human culture.
Oh no, he 100% agreed. Yes, he's a very unique individual. Okay, but he had these mystical episodes himself, which he describes in the same books. His heroes developing from within and fighting all the space vampires, okay, and the mind parasites, fighting all those bogeymen to develop the inner man, and it's suddenly they'll have automatically this wonderful mystical experience, which knocks away the whole idea of developing the inner man. So he's a contradiction in terms. An interesting guy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Alex has got his hand up. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, hello, fellas. Thanks, Vaughan, for the presentation. I was wondering, you know, as you were discussing this question of ultimate points and the so what, it made me think of Aristotle and something that I find very attractive, this idea that some actions or some ways of being are ends in themselves. And I thought that I was hearing something like that in Les's comment earlier as well. You know, he was discussing philosophy, you know, going on a philosophy meeting, and you might ask, well, so what? You know, why are you doing that? And he will say, well, that's just an end in itself.
Yes.
You know, and I think what's really important about those experiences is that the question, so what, doesn't actually arise for the person who is in it. Right? Like, I don't need to be asking that question because the action itself is the answer. Like the fact that I'm here doing this. And I'm wondering how that would relate, because I mean, you keep asking, well, so what? But that just seems kind of irrelevant because the question is not really alive to me as I am, let's say, you know, parenting my son or playing a soccer game or talking philosophy.
None of those things, all those things are valuable and wonderful, But in the end, so what? And you're not going to even bother about asking those things, nor do you need to. But I'm coming from an ultimate pointlessness, an ultimate existential position. So what? Okay.
Well, but what that makes me wonder, though, is what it makes me wonder is whose perspective is that? Because it almost seems like you are taking the question, so what, to be an end in itself. Like that activity of asking, so what, becomes a kind of end in itself. I don't understand whose point of view from whose point of view is that question coming?
It's coming from my point of view in this particular presentation today, and in an attempt to stimulate lots of discussion like this. But of course, you're quite welcome to be like Aristotle says, especially in his Nicomachean Ethics. The action is the end in itself. You don't need to go about bothering about so what. But here's me today as an existentialist saying, so what? Why? And you're not beholden to give me an answer. I guess I'm just stirring up a bit here.
Yeah, but it almost seems to me like when you ask that question, it's like you take a kind of a God's eye point of view.
Yes.
That is like you step outside of any human reference point and you take on a kind of divine, all-seeing, all-knowing point of view that I guess some physicists maybe like to take as well. But that seems to me to kind of belie what human experience is actually like.
No, I don't think it is. I think that what you're saying about human experience is probably the majority. People are self-contained, don't question so what or why. They do these things for the sheer value of doing it. They go and see the rugby with their son. They watch Australia get thrashed by New Zealand every time. That's okay. But I'm saying it on a wider existential parameters. So what? Why? I'm not asking people to ask that themselves. I'm just coming across to you as a philosopher, an existential philosopher. Okay, with a lot of readings and meetings with Wilson, and saying he's very much well worth looking at. But in the end, especially his new existentialism, there's a bit of so what about it. I guess I'm more interested in the mystical side of him. That contradicts a lot of what he's coming across as a step-by-step philosopher. When you have those mystical episodes, all the sort of stuff we're talking about today is absolutely the last thing on your mind.
At this point, I'd like to thank Dr. Vaughan Rapatahana for his talk on presentation on Colin Wilson and his new existentialism.